Oh, hello. Welcome back to the Fleeting Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Leffler, the armchair attorney, real life lawyer, and real life trailer enthusiast. I'm excited to have you here and have a conversation with some of the movers and shakers of this industry, whether we're talking about manufacturers, brokers, motor carriers, shippers, as they also call themselves, like manufacturers. We love to have you on. We love to help you understand this incredible business that we find ourselves in. And like any great person in the podcasting space, we got to give a shout out to the people that help make this thing work. The first one is right there, my floating disembodied head, armchair attorney. That is the guy who's right there. He does this little thing. Also, our friends at Contract Leasing Corporation. Contract Leasing Corporation is a trailer leasing company with over 18,000 commercial trailers and chassis on the road. We help move things for you. If you have a problem that looks like a trailer, we may have a solution that also looks like a trailer. Now, before we bring in our guest today, Brett Suma from Loadsmith, I am so excited about this conversation, not just because of the robots, but that's a big part of it, but also the trailers. Now, let me tell you something. When I talk about the supply chain, really what I'm talking about is trailers. You see, trailers are the supply chain. And people might say, Matt, that sounds unreasonable. Clearly, the supply chain is at least 75% trailers. Maybe 80%. No. Trailers are everything. Now, when I explain supply chain to people, I begin by talking about trailers. See, somewhere across the world, someone made something or made materials, and they're going to put those things into a box. We call that a TEU, a 20-foot equivalent unit. They're 20 feet long. Sometimes they're 40 feet long, and then we call those, essentially 2 TEUs. That box gets picked up by a giant crane, kind of like you'd see at a little game store where you have the claw machine and you pick up that stuffed animal. That then gets put onto a boat. Now, the boat carries a whole bunch of containers. Now, I look at containers as trailers, and I look at the power unit of that boat as the power unit pulling a bunch of trailers. Those containers arrive somewhere, whether it's a port or some other place. And when I get to the port, another giant crane picks up that container. That container then goes on something else, whether it's a train, maybe, or a chassis, a subframe. And a chassis is really just a delicious BLT, brakes, lights, and tires. Once that container gets onto that chassis, it gets moved somewhere, maybe to a warehouse, maybe to a break bulk center, maybe to some place where it may find its new home. Chances are, though, they unload that container. And when it's unloaded, that stuff gets put in a trailer. And that trailer then goes to a warehouse or a distribution center or places all across the country. So at the end of the day, I love power units. They're a great proxy for where the freight is. But the reality is, I love trailers. I think they're amazing. 53-foot vans with swing doors, give them to me. 48-foot with a roll-up, I'm all about that. Wait a second, you're talking about chassis, a 2040 combo with triaxles? Now you're talking my language. So as we get down this path of understanding trailers, we have to understand the people that use them. And so you have to understand from my perspective, I'm a maintenance guy at heart. I'm a leasing guy now, but I'm a trailer enthusiast. And so when I want to understand how the market works and how it's happening in the freight world, I bring in experts who can give the insights about what's happened in the market. We have seen some crazy stuff. And so I'm so excited to bring my friend Brett Suma on the podcast today to talk about his company, his journey in the supply chain, and what he thinks is in store for the future. So without further ado, Brett Suma, how are you?
I'm well, Matt. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. I have been following you guys for a little bit, but for the folks who don't know you, who is Brett Suma? What is Loadsmith?
Loadsmith is, it's not just me, it's our team of people. And we really look at the supply chain and transportation, excuse me. And we're really looking at what does 2030 look like? What does 2040 look like? And how do we build today for tomorrow? And so everything that we're doing today, we have a roadmap that really has 5 key components to it. We're probably about 2.5 way through in terms of what we're building. And so what we're really trying to build is a supply chain solution that solves basically 3 big problems, which is labor, sustainability, and environment, and then ultimately elasticity of supply. And so when we look at those 3 things as being the big 3 things that need to be addressed in transportation over the course of the next decades. That's really where we focus our time.
Okay, so let's wind back the clock. So how in the world did you get into supply chain to begin with? And when you got in, did anyone say, "Hey, you don't ever get out of it"? Did anyone have that conversation with you?
No, nobody had that conversation, but it is very true. In 1999, I'm aging myself now, Matt. But in 1999, I was a freshman at Arizona State University, and I needed a job, and so I answered an ad in the paper for a company called Knight Transportation.
I've heard of them.
Who at the time was just less than a decade old and had less than 1,000 trucks. And my first position was in driver payroll, and so I did driver payroll, and then I worked my way up in that company. I spent 20 years there, progressive management roles, progressive leadership roles. Really worked a lot on the technology side of things towards the end of my career.
Interesting. So you spent your entire career at Knight, and you went through the merger of Knight Swift. Like, did you know when you were going in that company had that kind of horsepower behind it?
Well, I think when I look at Knight, there was basically 2 decades that I worked there, and the first decade was all organic growth.
Yeah,
and it was super exciting to be there in the 2000s because of the organic growth. You would look at a map and say, well, where are we going to open 2 or 3 service centers this year, and who's going to get the service center manager job, who's going to get the sales job, who's going to, and so it was super exciting. And really, in those times, it was very forced growth. And what I mean by that was that if you open the Denver service center, Joe Vitrito, who's now the CEO of PAM Transportation, opened the Denver service center. And so, so you really got a really good education in business, not just freight, not just drivers, but you had P&L responsibility. When I was 27 years old, and had full P&L responsibility for the largest service center of the organization.
Wow.
And so I had 300 drivers that worked for me.
That's
and
incredible.
so that first 10 years of my career, where it was very organic and growth, was really where I cut my teeth in understanding how freight worked, understanding drivers, understanding networks, all of that. Then the second half of my career there, that's where we saw a lot more of the M&A activity.
Yeah.
And how do we integrate businesses? How do we work on optimization and utilization and efficiency? And really, the last 10 years of my career was those last 3 things: optimization, efficiency, and utilization.
That's a fascinating thing, because like I got into this business, it was kind of predetermined. This was the path I had to go because my dad was a roadway guy back in the 70s. And so I look back, and a lot of my friends in the business cut their teeth with the roadways, the yellows, the CFs. And as time went on, after deregulation, you start seeing this explosion of motor carriers and this growth of truckload companies. And I can imagine like that those first 10 years of Knight was a fantastically interesting period. And then you come in and you get to watch this essentially a juggernaut. I mean, no one probably knew going in it was going to be one of the largest motor carriers in the United States history. But, there you have it. What are the things that would surprise you? When I saw AAA Cooper get purchased, I was like, wait a second, they want to do LTL. They want to do the hardest part of supply chain. Like, what do you think about that deal? Were you a part of that? Were you involved in those were happening?
No, that kind of happened after I left. But I think to give some context to the story of Knight Transportation, which I'm very intimately familiar with. When they started the company, they thought that they may be able to grow to 250 trucks.
Okay, there you go.
And so I think that when you look at, Randy and his vision, and then bringing Gary and Kevin into the business, Kevin obviously had a tremendous amount of drive to grow that business. Gary and Keith, amazing human beings, smart, hardworking. Keith is probably the hardest working person I've ever met in my entire life. Wow. And so when you look at the 4 of them and what they were able to do with a hope to grow to 250 trucks, and then now to be what they're doing, and look, the freight cycles are the freight cycles. They know how to manage through them. There's probably 5 companies that are the real bellwethers of it. You could say Hunt. Yeah. And how they diversify and look at things. CH, obviously, because of the length of time and the breadth of business. You have to throw Knight right there.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing story. And, our team, most of them have a lot of experience from working at Knight. There's a lot of crossover in terms of how we operate. and how we see things. So I wouldn't trade my 20 years there. I just felt towards the end that I had maybe a little bit of a bigger purpose on what I saw and what I thought that we could build, and really the why. And that's why Loadsmith started.
Let's talk about that. So to be in supply chain, you got to be kind of insane anyway. Like, I think that kind of comes with the territory. To be an entrepreneur, you have to be a special kind of insane. So let's talk about, like, what would precipitate you saying, I want to have all the vendors, all the employees, all of the customers, and have all those problems sit on my shoulders. What was the motivation behind that?
Well, when I hit year 17 at night, I decided to go back to school.
Okay.
And it was the second time I had gone back to school while I worked at night. But I had decided to go back to school at year 17 because I thought 20 years is how long I'm going to do this at night. And what's next after that? And so in 2017, when I went back to, when I went back to school in 2015, which was right around year 17, I ended up getting accepted to a degree program at Harvard. And I was doing that. And I thought if I immersed myself around smart people who had different business backgrounds, I would find the next thing for myself. And trucking and transportation logistics was not what I thought I would do. I thought I would find something, unique or different. Ultimately, I ended up having to write a business plan for one of my courses, and I wrote the business plan for Loadsmith. And so that was really hard to put down. And then there was some other things that occurred. The ELD mandate of 2017.
Yeah.
That opened my eyes to what the future would be. Then you had Forkites come on, and that was eye-opening in terms of visibility and how one could build a very connected and very visible business without actually ever buying the trucks.
Interesting.
And so then you started to see new entrants into the market. I mean, Mastery came in, then you started looking at autonomous trucks.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
All these things started to really work for me and resonate. And ultimately, when I started working on Loadsmith in January of 2019, I spent 6 months researching the society.
Yeah,
it was a societal research project. It was not a trucking research project or a freight research project. It was societal. And
you have to be curious for these things. You have to be like, I want to understand, because to your point, like, supply chain is about how we fulfill desires and whatever it is. Like, everything is tied to what we do. So understanding how people will buy things in the future, how those things will be delivered, that makes a really interesting thing. So what did you come away with when you were thinking about all these things?
Well, I mean, so we did a tremendous amount of generational cohort theory research, which is odd to talk about.
Sounds interesting.
But essentially it's breaking down different generations and their value structures. And so when you start to think about, the baby boomer generation, Gen X, which I'm a participant of, and then millennials and Gen Zs.
I hear the millennials are the best. I think I'm part of that cohort. So I feel like they're probably the best. I could be wrong.
I tease my kids often that everything great in their life was from a Gen Xer, but
I don't disagree with that. Okay. How old are your kids? Your family, man. So how old are your kids?
I have 4 boys, and they're 10, 12, 14, and 16.
Oh my goodness. I have 4 as well. 10 and 7 are my 2 older boys. I have twins that are going to be 1 year old, boy and a girl, November 15th. Okay. So you have done this study. You're learning about where you think future buying behaviors. And I think, to your point, the trends and the forces that shape our industry shape all industries. It's this idea of automation, connectivity. You mentioned Forkites and Project 44 to the same kind of extent. This idea of electrification is part of this pathway. And then this idea of sharing, like borrowing things. So what gets you to the place where you say, I want to make this company? And did you have the vision then about autonomous trucks? Did you think about this? Or did that kind of come after you've kind of already proved out the thesis of Loadsmith?
Well, really, the generational cohort research is what led me to define Loadsmith further. So if you looked at Gen Z as an example, and the future of work and the future of workers. And so you say, well, what is their value system? And they value different things than baby boomers did. And so Gen Z as an example, much more likely and willing to work in the trades, plumber, electrician, okay?
Yeah.
Not going to be an over-the-road truck driver would probably consider being a local driver, though.
Yeah, there you go. True.
Now you had millennials, the next group of decision makers and policymakers. Okay. So as baby boomers exit out of the decision making seats, okay, as older Gen Xers exit out of the decision making seats, and they're backfilled by millennials who've been raised with technology. Technology is embedded in everything they do.
Yeah.
Number one car brand for a millennial is a Tesla. Number one reason, because it's zero emission. Number two reason, because it can drive itself.
Yeah, I can't fit 6 people in it. That's the problem.
Well, there you go. That is the issue. But the point being is that as society changes, and as the decision makers and policymakers change, and as the consumer changes, and as the worker changes, we have to be adaptive to that. And so really the generational cohort research was really what led me to what was possible with Loadsmith. And we're not talking, we don't talk in terms of quarters or years in my business. We talk in terms of decades.
Yeah.
Right? We're building this business for decades. And so we're really focused in on that. And so then how do we position ourselves? So, then we talk about Carl Jung and Jungian archetypes and how do we resonate and how do we hit those characteristics of all those different value structures of the 4 different generations that we're speaking to. And so there was a lot of like psychology and sociology wrapped up into Loadsmith. Even if you look at our color scheme, we word scraped all 50 of the largest competitors. Websites, did adjective banks, how did they message, who do they message to, what was their coloring, what emotive properties of coloring is. And then when you look at our logo, we probably get more comments about our logo than anything. And
how long was that process to come up with the logo? Was that like a group of people working together, or how did you get that as your choice?
Well, so where I started from Loadsmith was I hired a branding agency in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And so my first meeting about Loadsmith was with a branding agency. The first question was, well, how are you different?
Okay.
My answer was, I'm starting here.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good answer. That's a very good answer.
How do I position myself? How do we build this business and how do we relate to people? We want to be an autonomous trucking company, but we love the truck driver.
Yeah.
And in fact, my older brother is a truck driver, and we love them. And we want to build a platform in which they are able to do their craft. Okay, Loadsmith, the name Loadsmith really comes back to logistics as a craft, driving as a craft. Okay, and so we love them and we want to build the future for them, not replace them.
Okay,
and that's the ultimate goal for us, is to be the force multiplier of highly lucrative first and last mile jobs.
That's a really good point you bring up. So like the idea of, we see in the industry now, the biggest concerns motor carriers bring up is the idea of driver retention, driver shortage, all these things about people not wanting to do the job for what it's being paid for. My father's company, we started back in 91. Our biggest customer eventually became FedEx Ground. It was RPS before that. But that was a business that was founded on the premise of, let's take the drivers and make them contractors. Let's change the dynamic from employee to contractor. And in my mind, I look at this and go, automation does that similar thing. It's like, it takes another cog out and makes something a little bit more compelling. Because the LTL guys, they don't have the driver turnover that the truckload folks have. Like I've seen truckload companies that are 90%, 110%. They lose people every day. Whereas the LTL folks, where you can be home in your bed every night, there's a really significant value there. So is this idea for the organization to solve part of the driver shortage issue? Or is it more like, let's take the tools that exist now to solve the problem of moving freight, as it's always been a problem of moving freight?
Well, I think coming back to the conversation about what we're trying to solve, right? The first thing we're trying to solve is labor.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about solving the driver shortage problem. We're talking about creating an environment in which we're the force multiplier of the types of jobs that the next generation of workers want to do.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at Gen Z and you peel back the onion on them, first off, they're not going to make the same sacrifices that baby boomers made, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay. Now that doesn't mean that they're lazy. Maybe that just means that we've not caught up to society.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of someone being comfortable being away from home 200 nights a year, for my father's generation, like, yeah, that's what you had to do to survive, but that is not necessarily what you have to do to survive anymore. So I think what you're making, it makes a lot of sense to say, let's prioritize how people of the future want to work. And the idea of being able to do, local and city stuff with a human being, but then automate the thing that everyone hates, the middle mile, seems really, really, really compelling.
Well, 100%. And then the other thing about it too is that, as long as I've worked in this business, the drivers that were the highest compensated generally were the ones that were willing to sacrifice the most.
Yeah.
Stay out the longest, be away from home more, miss, events, those types of things. And the local drivers were often the lowest paid because they were, deemed sacrificing the least. Right. And the reality is that it's a supply demand function. Okay. There's a large supply of drivers that would love to be home every single night. The demand for that hasn't been there. Now we'll get to the trailers in a minute, because the trailers is a huge, huge component of how all of this works for one very key reason, and it's about labor.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump right into this. So one of the things that I learned from my experience with the LTLs, and I'm obsessed with LTL. I think it's the most interesting type of transportation out there. But what is so important in LTL, and actually for every motor carrier, is drop and hook. The ability for a driver to just go get the thing and then go, and then drop it off and get another thing and go, and not wait. And the only way a driver can do that is having access to trailers. If you don't have access to trailers, that idea is gone. You have to have it. So let's talk about trailers, because I'm a trailer guy. I love a good trailer story. So what made you think? So obviously you're thinking robots, and that obviously connects directly to trailers. So let's talk about the trailers. So how is your thinking when it comes to trailing equipment?
Well, first, let's focus on the labor. So let's all wrap our head around that drivers would rather be, and not all drivers. Okay. I'm not speaking for the all of the drivers. Okay. Because there's a lot of really great drivers that love the open road. They love, they love what they do. I respect them immensely. They will always have a place in the supply chain to do their craft. And it is a craft. Yeah. Let's not
absolutely
debate that. Okay. But if we look at Gen Z and we say the next generation of workers is going to want that first last mile job, well, we solve for it through an autonomous middle mile. Okay. Now, an autonomous truck, okay, has a utilization scoring. Every time I pencil it out, it lands somewhere between 2.2 and 2.8. So I just round it to 2.5. What that means is that the availability of uptime of an autonomous truck to move is 2.5 times greater than the available uptime of a human driver. Yeah. And so you can move as much mileage freight, 2.5 times more with an autonomous truck than you can with a human-driven truck, which means you're going to have an odd ratio of trailers. Let's say that you worked at night and it was 2.5 to 1, 2.5 trailers to 1 tractor forever. Then it went to 2.8, then it went to 3. Okay. You're going to have 2.5x the number of trailers in order to make that autonomous middle mile work. But beyond that, let's talk about labor for a second. Labor, okay, is going to replace the cost of the trailer in terms of what is the greatest cost. And so what I mean by that is that forever the driver, and I'm speaking directly to the drivers now, forever the drivers have shouldered the inefficiency in the supply chain. Think about it. They get paid by the mile.
Yeah.
They don't control the pickup appointment or the delivery appointment. Okay. And so the driver has shouldered the inefficiency that exists in the supply chain. Let's take a 500-mile length of haul as an example. Well, an optimal pickup time for that's probably 9 a.m. in the morning, and an optimal delivery time for that is probably, 9 p.m. at night. Give the driver a little bit of time, get loaded quickly, get unloaded quickly. But what if that appointment time is not like that, right? And it could be that way 3 times, and then the next time it's a 9 a.m. and a 9 a.m. the next day, or it's a noon the next day. And the driver has no control over the appointments. And there is not a lot of coordination between shippers and consignees in regard to appointment times. And so how large fleets have made up for that is by having trailer pools, right? Like, so they can
exactly. Absolutely. A bunch of drop trailers.
Yep. But they have still continued, the drivers have still continued to shoulder the inefficiency in the supply chain because they get paid by the mile. And it doesn't matter if that load takes them 10 hours or 24 hours to complete, their pay is still the same.
Okay? Absolutely.
Now with trailers, you can transfer the inefficiency from the driver to the inanimate object.
Exactly.
What I would tell you is that in a few years, the cost of labor is going to outpace the cost of additional trailers. It will be in the trucking company's best interest to have more trailers because they can do more with their labor if they have a lot of flexibility with their labor. And the only way they will be able to do that is with trailers.
I love this because I was talking to a buddy of mine who started his career at CF, and he had the same experience that my father did at Roadway. January 1st every year, you go outside and you count your trailers because you had a ratio of one piece of power to 7 or 10 trailers because you didn't know where they were. There wasn't telematics. That's newfangled technology. But as you've outlined this, the idea of connected trailers that can speak to where they are means you don't need as many. But to your point, even if you're slip seating a truck, I mean, you still have unproductive miles. You have still waiting periods and all the different, hours of service regulations. An autonomous truck is not going to have those same problems. Ostensibly, they're not going to need a meal period, as far as I can tell. So this idea of needing additional trailers really makes a lot of sense. And I can see why you guys have moved in this direction. Now, the regulatory landscape is very challenging for autonomous. I will mention like Governor Newsom in California vetoed the bill that would have mandated a driver in that thing. FMCSA is still looking at level 4, level 5 automation. But from my conversation with the folks at Kodiak, among others, the technology is almost there. I mean, you can move freight now with robots. It's just a regulatory exercise. What are your thoughts on the regulatory landscape as we look at this stuff?
Well, again, I think that you have to understand the generational shift. I don't resonate with some shippers based off of their time and tenure in their roles. Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't resonate with some trucking executives based off of their time and tenure in their roles, right? Drivers probably don't believe me all the time when I tell them that I love them and I appreciate them and that I'm not trying to replace them. In fact, what I'm trying to do is create a next generation of driver. Mm-hmm. But in that vein, the next decision makers and policymakers, key being policymakers, their appetite for technology is much different than the exiting and the retiring individuals. And so, I don't think if you're not working on this stuff now that you're going to be ready when the regulatory environment catches up with the technology. I really believe that where we're at is the technology is in front of the regulatory environment. Look, I'm not anti-union by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. I think the Teamsters Union, open invitation to have a conversation with me. Why can't there be large union represented, drayage companies, first and last mile companies, right? Better jobs.
I mean, that's a really interesting question you bring up because like for the Teamsters, I feel for them. I mean, in 1980, I'm going to go back in the way back machine, 60% of drivers were unionized and they were mostly Teamsters. Fast forward today, there's only a handful of union motor carriers left. I mean, you have UPS obviously doing their stuff. T-Force, TFI picked up UPS freight, became T-Force. You have ABF owned by ArcBest. Not a lot left. But to your point, like we see the stuff with AB5 in California, there is still a place for organized labor and transportation. It's not what it used to be. And I think that the innovation that we're going to see, unions had a purpose. I think a lot, they still have a purpose now, but not the same as it does today. I mean, you can have a great motor carrier like an Old Dominion or a Walmart that pays drivers really well and gives them good benefits. And the need for unionization isn't there. But I do find it interesting you bring that up because, man, I can see like the target you'd have people going, oh, the robots are coming and all these other pieces. But to your point, these are jobs we can't fill now. I mean, that's that reality. The jobs aren't as competitive as they once were. And if you can get someone home every day and automate parts of the process, we've already done it in manufacturing. Make people get surprised, but like the biggest suck in this was high-speed manufacturing and automation. Like you didn't need a bunch of people in the manufacturing process that you did 15, 20 years ago. So
well, I think to your point, like first off, if you can force multiply the first and last mile jobs, you've now changed the supply and demand curve, which will do what for wages?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay? So it'll increase them. Now you're going to drive down the middle mile cost because your uptime available hours of an autonomous truck is more. Okay. So you're going to be able to use that truck more, drive down the middle mile cost, which means that you can afford to pay more on the first and last mile. And I'm not anti-union, but I'm also very capitalistic when I say that there should be big drayage companies that pop up in the major shipping lanes on either end.
Yeah.
And my personal opinion is that when I look at the Loadsmith Freight Network and I look at our origin and destination pairings, I would love to go out and find contract carriers that want to sign a 3-year contract.
Yeah.
For first and last mile pickup and deliveries. And I know what my cost is going to be for the next 3 years. They know, I mean, I've written dedicated contract agreements. I've operated dedicated contract agreements in a local environment. I operated the Macy's local business in LA with 104 stores that we serviced.
Yeah.
I know what you can do in a 3 or 5 year contract. Maybe it's a 3+1 extension. Those are the types of jobs that we can create through an autonomous middle mile.
Now, to build off that, I would love to get your thoughts on. So my understanding of the autonomous middle mile is local drivers are bringing this thing to let's say a travel center or a parking facility where that handoff happens between the human being and the robot. Now, we know the truck parking remains a critical problem in the industry. I think that gets alleviated on the autonomous side over time, but where did we find the real estate to do these handoffs? Like, is the real estate there now? Do you have to find partners to build these things? Like, I know Baton's a good example. They got bought by Ryder, I think last year. Like, how do you solve that problem?
Well, the real estate's, an interesting one because there's already a tremendous amount of real estate dedicated to trucking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. You're going to see trucking companies. I mean, I think Knight Swift has probably like 200 locations or something like that. Like their real estate portfolio is amazing, right? You're going to see those types of things happen. I wouldn't be surprised to see customers having, for interplant moves and those types of things, dedicating, landing and launching, pads. I wouldn't be surprised to see trailer manufacturers have landing and launching components, right?
I can see that.
And then obviously I think that you're going to see like the Prologises of the world and Hillwood and Pilot Flying J also, participate. There's a lot of work to be done though. And it's funny, Matt, because oftentimes I get told, well, like that's like 2030.
Yeah.
And I'm like, gosh, I know. Can you believe that we only have 7 years?
It still feels like it's 2015. I don't understand. No, you're right. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the future comes faster than people expect typically.
Well, if you're not working on it today, you're not going to figure it out by then.
That's right.
Like you can't wait for the regulatory environment to start working on these things because there's a tremendous amount of data that we need to collect, that we need to organize, that we need to be able to prioritize, analyze, and ultimately give the optimizations. And so there's a lot going on.
So in order for you guys to, I saw the press release. It was, and I'll put that in the show notes. We'll put a bunch of stuff in the show notes about like the deal with Kodiak. Can we talk a little bit about that? Like, is it 800? Is that the number that is in the press release? What does that look like for you? Are you testing them now, or is it more like we will have these at some point soon?
Well, I love Kodiak. Okay.
I'm a fan.
Yep, I'm a big fan of Don. I'm a big fan of Michael. I'm a big fan of James. Okay. And I got to give a special shout out to Raj, who nobody knows Raj, but I love Raj too. And so, when we first started talking and the deal is for 800 to start. Okay. Now understand 800 to start is actually 2,000. Okay. Conventional.
Yeah.
You're doing 2.5x, right? So 800 to start. Okay. And that's why our deal with Wabash is for 6,000 trailers. That's a 3-to-1 ratio on traditional 2,000 tractors, 6,000.
Absolutely. It makes total sense.
And so, when we first started talking with Kodiak, Michael asked me point blank, he said, what does partnership look like to you? And partnership for me wasn't about testing. Like, they have plenty of companies that they're testing with, right?
Yeah.
Partnership to me was like, how do we develop together? And so our agreement is much different. And that's why I shouted out to Raj, because, Raj is a data scientist that works there. And that's who I talk to most.
Okay.
And so we, we're working on how do we build the network for Loadsmith to deploy the autonomous middle mile. And so that's why I love working with them, is because they're so open to wanting to develop, as opposed to just say, well, this is how we do it, and this is the lane, and we're testing this. And
well, I say I feel like you see the future. You see where this goes in terms of, like, if it's possible, it's probable. If it's probable, it's inevitable. But we've watched a lot of autonomous manufacturers and companies pull out. We saw like either the investor cash runs out, or they just feel this is too difficult of a regulatory landscape. You took an enormous risk. Like, how do you reconcile the idea of, like, where the future is going to be? You have to find a horse to bet on, and you chose the one that's still here. I mean, obviously there's other ones that are around, like Waymo and Too Simple. Like, what do you think about, like, how do you manage that risk? Because, like, you're an entrepreneur, you have a family, and you're betting on a technology that's not legal yet to operate interstate. So there's some headwinds. Like, how do you reconcile that?
Well, again, I think that if you look at the purpose of Loadsmith and how we measure our business in decades, not in quarters, okay, that's the first place, right? Then when you look at a company like Kodiak, who is very, very capital efficient,
yeah,
okay, and you compare them to Loadsmith, who is very, very capital efficient, okay, those two value structures align. And when you ask Don, okay, his why is really rooted in safety. From a childhood, I don't want to speak for Don, okay, but his passion is rooted in safety. My passion is rooted in labor. And so when you're passionate about something, the bet becomes less, because you understand what your purpose is, and so you just focus in on building that.
Well, I love that you bring that up, because, like, one of the things a lot of the viewers we have, or the listeners at home, I talk about a lot, is like how unsafe most commercial vehicles are. I mean, if you look at the International Road Check, it's 1 in 5. Like, if I had 5 gallons of milk and said, hey, one of these is unsafe, which one would you like? You'd be like, I don't want to buy any of those milks. And my central idea when it comes to automation is these things will likely be maintained better. They will likely require more types of maintenance activities, insofar as it's validating the sensors are working. You're not having a driver pre and post trip. You're probably having a mechanic do that. So for me, I look at this as a safety play ultimately. But to your same point, on the labor side, we can't staff the jobs that we're out there because people don't want to do them. And for whatever reason, they just don't. So you have to find a solution. The solution isn't going to be, hey, America, stop buying things. Like, that's not a solution. The solution has to be some level of leveraging technology to solve the age-old problem of moving something safely, on time, and undamaged. So that makes sense to me. Now, you mentioned something, and now this is the part I'm really excited about being good stewards of capital. Like, that's a really interesting thing, because apparently you might have, I don't know if you heard about this. There's another company that had an issue. We're reading this all day long. Convoy, right? I love the folks at Convoy. I know a lot of people over there. I believe in their central thesis. I just think they didn't have the right people in the room in some cases when it comes to, what freight is all about. But you had an amazing post. And I would like just kind of, for those who are in the background, can you kind of talk about a little bit, like, what's been going on in the freight world for the last few months, and then what's going on in the last couple of weeks, maybe?
Yeah, well, I first off, Matt, I think that, look, this is a very difficult time for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And sometimes that can bring out the best of people, and sometimes that frustration can get the better of us. Okay. And sometimes I think that frustration getting the better of us can we try to make light of the situation. Maybe it's worse for somebody else, and so we like to point out that. And there's, humor often, drives people to make them feel better. Right.
Yeah.
And so I had noticed over the course of the last few months that I think that the stress of the environment that we're in was getting the better of people, and people. And look, I have a very, I always try to get rid of the noise in my life, meaning that I know what my purpose is. I know what Loadsmith's purpose is. We're going to continue to build that business. We don't need the noise of what this company's doing, that company's doing.
Mhm.
I don't try to compare myself from a growth perspective. I don't try to compare myself from a customer acquisition perspective or this culture, that culture. Should I be an agent? Should I work for a company? Like all of that to me is just noise.
Yeah.
And I just want to make sure that Loadsmith stays pointed to our North Star, and that our internal culture, okay, is what it should be, and which is a collaborative place to work, a positive place to work. Are we perfect? No. Do we have stressful days? Yes. Freight has always been a grind. I think it always will be a grind.
Yeah.
But I just noticed this we were going down this path of people almost rooting against one another instead of rooting for each other. Incidentally, if you went back to, I think, September 25th of 2020, and I was new to LinkedIn at that time, okay, and there was just this debate on Convoy, releasing their spot API pricing. And there was this conversation about, so it's spot, but you don't call it spot and whatever. And the Journal of Commerce wrote an article about it, and they quoted my quote from LinkedIn. I didn't know you could even do that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, who wrote this? Is it Eric Johnson writing that article?
I don't know. I'd have to go back and find it. And so, but in it, I say, I'm rooting for Convoy just like I'm rooting for everybody else.
Yeah.
That was in September of 2020. Okay. Fast forward to October of 2023, and people are rooting against each other. And that this model doesn't work, and this is the only way to do things, and that, and I stayed out of it, but then we got brought into it.
Yeah,
and quite frankly, the irony in all of it, Matt, is that there was a little bingo card of who was going bankrupt.
Yeah,
and we were listed in it, and every other company that was listed in it had raised a tremendous amount of VC money. Exactly. And I actually got a text from somebody who I really admire, and his response was, "It's crazy that you're getting lumped in with all these VC people. You have great marketing." And so,
about 30% of what you raise goes into sales and marketing. So that's a very nice compliment.
Yeah. So it wasn't a bad compliment. So I was like, okay, but the problem with that is the association, right?
And the perception. You can't afford that. You can't have that.
I can't afford for a shipper to read it and think, oh, well, what's going on here? I can't afford OTR solutions to read it and put a pause on buying my payments until, because a lot of carriers use them, right? So it was, so my initial reaction was I was upset because I want to protect my business, and more than anything, I want to protect my employees.
Yeah.
Right. And so this was all occurring in the early hours of the morning, and I was upset, and I had to give myself some time to compose myself and say, who do I want to be here? And I have to be true to myself, and it is not my nature to try to to not be positive about what we're going through. And so I posted a message that I think resonated with a lot of people. And, look, we've not raised money to date. We've been fortunate that we've not had to do that. That doesn't mean that we won't. It doesn't mean that we won't need to bring things to market that will require that. I'm not saying that VC money is bad or private equity is bad. All I'm saying is that we don't want to be lumped in with somebody who's going through a struggle, because we don't want carriers or customers or factoring companies to think differently about us. But at the same time, can't we just have some empathy for all of the people who lost their jobs and may have a hard time, given the current freight cycle, landing somewhere in their profession that they like? I mean, you go back to day one of Loadsmith. I'm sitting at La Visual in Los Angeles, California, and they ask me how I feel about transportation and logistics, and I say logistics is a craft.
Yeah.
Logisticians are craftspeople. I've worked next to them for decades, figuring out puzzles, right? And so this is what we do. The very first thing you asked me today was, did anybody tell you that once you were in it, you wouldn't want to get out of it? Well, think about all those people who got in it that love it, that suddenly were out of it.
Yeah.
And may have a hard time finding their way back in for 6 months.
That's right. I mean, to your point, like, that's why I titled the podcast "A Place of Positivity," because your post was so it was so well timed. I mean, to your point, we all look for bad news. Like, that's, as human beings, like, we gravitate towards the things that revile and disgust us and anger us, because that's just the simple part of our lizard brains. Happy things are okay in small doses, but your post was such a positive message. And I think what I love about your background, having done this now for 20 years or more than 20 years, this industry is cyclical. Like, this is how it's always been. There are people who came into this business in 2021, 2022. They have no concept of how bad it can be, because our highs are high and our lows are low. And even in the best circumstances, those great moments are only here for a very short time. And we're looking at the numbers and we're thinking, okay, how much longer does this go? And you hear different people say, oh, Q2 of 2024. I've heard Q3, Q4 of next year. I haven't heard Q1 of 2025. These are terrifying things to think about, but this is how it's always been. The smart companies, the lean companies, can weather this. The ones that haven't played well or didn't realize what markets happen don't survive. And it's always been feast or famine. Do you have any opinion on, like, when this gets back to where we might think it looks good again, or is it going to be a dark winter, you think?
Well, my opinion is it's May 17th.
Okay. All right. I'm going to write that down. We'll have you on the podcast. We'll make a special edition for that. Why May 17th?
I'll back into that. Okay.
Okay.
In July of 2021, I felt very, very uncomfortable about the market from a spot freight to contract ratio. The market was not acting rational in July of 21 in relation to contract to spot. Okay. We changed our entire sales approach in the RFP period from July of 21 through the end of the year. And we were very, very aggressive in going and contracting a tremendous amount of freight, knowing that we would lose money on it in Q4 of 21 specifically. But we knew that the market, in July of 21, we knew that the market was stalling. Okay. Most people, when I tell them that, think that I'm crazy to have thought that in July of 21. Okay. The market was stalling in July of 21. I felt very uncomfortable about our amount of contract freight. We went to the market. We accumulated a tremendous amount of contract freight. Everybody knows that the market peaked in January of 2022. Okay. And had a precipitous fall for, now we're looking at, almost 22 months now.
Yeah, exactly.
Loadsmith has benefited tremendously from that call of July of 2021. Okay. I don't, and so in early Q2 of 2022, okay, is when I contacted Jeff Silver about becoming a mastery customer. Okay. Loadsmith really had no business even making that phone call, given our size. Okay. But I knew that we would have the opportunity in 2023 to build out our tech stack, reorganize our business. We had to go from one business entity, just a freight brokerage, to a holding corporation that holds our freight brokerage, holds our transportation company, and holds our leasing company. I knew that we could do that in Q1. I knew that we could start bringing trailers on in Q2 because I had made my agreement with Wabash in August of 2022, and that we would go live with Mastery in Q3 of 2023. The reason I wanted to do it in 23 was because I knew that we wouldn't be up to our gills in freight.
Yeah. Okay.
And so let's build our tech stack. Let's build for the future in 23 when it's a down market, okay, and that we're just riding along on our contract freight. 90% of Loadsmith's freight's contract. 90% of that freight comes in via EDI.
I see.
We manage 1,000 loads a week with 5 account managers.
Wow.
So we don't have a single outbound, like we don't have a sales floor calling customers trying to bring on freight. We don't pay anybody in our organization with commission, carrier sales, account management. There's none of that.
I see.
So when you say, when is the market going to change? And if you were to visit John Decker, who's our vice president of power only operations, he probably has May 17th circled on his calendar. And I told him that about a year ago.
Wow.
Okay. May 17th of this next year is going to be a very difficult weekend for people to cover freight. Okay. It just is going to be. What you're going to see coming out of road check, okay, going into Memorial Day weekend, it's not going to take us, by the time we get to May 17th, the capacity that's needed to have left the market is going to have left the market.
That's a good point. That's the thing people kind of forget is we're going to continue to see people exit the business because of the nature of things. So you think May 17th, would you be willing, if I have a podcast, I put something up together, we do like a lightning round maybe?
I'll be here. Well, okay. I'll be really busy that day.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe the day before, the day after. We can find.
But going into Memorial Day weekend, you're going to see all we need is a little increase in demand. Demand is what moves the freight cycles. Capacity does not move the freight cycles. Capacity determines on how high and how low the freight cycles get. But demand is what moves the freight cycles.
So on the demand side, that's a really interesting question because, interest rates remain high. Student loans are back in place. I know myself because I am paying them again. It's always exciting, but like there's a lot less disposable income. Do you think that ends up kind of not being an issue come May 17th? Or do you think that's still something that kind of impacts, but not to the extent that's going to stop the demand from growing?
Well, where people are spending their disposable income now. I mean, I fly out of the Denver airport every week and it's a zoo. Right? So, yes, that's a good statement. Where are people spending their income today? Okay. Where are inventory levels at now? Okay. Look at the shippers index in terms of inventory levels. Are they more than likely to replenish? No, they're all holding and waiting. Okay. So I believe, and look, I'm not an economist at all. Okay. But I have been through a tremendous amount of freight cycles. And when you look at what's happening in terms of, Heartland posted 102.4 OR.
Yeah. Okay. That's crazy. That's crazy.
Knight Swift, highest OR ever. Okay. There is no more rate to give. There just isn't. And so there's no more room to go lower. And the reality of that is that the largest fleets are going to start pulling trucks out. They're going to right size their fleets. Heartland said, "Hey, look, we're going to get rid of our unprofitable business." Okay.
Saya's talking about raising rates in January. I mean, this is the new. Yeah, you're exactly right. Absolutely.
And so, you're going to see. Look, the freight markets are cyclical. They just are. They're led by demand. Okay. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, demand. I'm not talking about demand for Memorial Day. Okay. What I'm talking about is when we see demand, we're seeing demand 12 weeks ahead of when it's coming back. Right.
Yeah.
And so when I say May 17th, I'm not talking about, some emergency water shipments to replenish, Walmart going into Memorial Day because they have a lost leader for $3.99 for a 24-pack of water. What I'm talking about is the replenishment of inventories on all SKUs, okay, non-food related SKUs, that need to hit by July 4th, or snow blowers manufactured in Q1 that need to be at Lowe's distribution centers to be put out for October. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's going to be a replenishment and a restocking that occurs, and coming out of road check, going into Memorial Day, the demand is going to kick up just enough, and the capacity is going to have shrunk just enough to where there's going to be a capitulation.
I feel the people in the back are just cheering for this, thinking that it's not going to be Q3 or Q4. Now we're getting close to the hour here, Brett. I want to ask you, if people want to learn more about you and what you're doing with Loadsmith, where can they find more information about you and your business?
Well, if you go to loadsmith.com and you watch our video on the front page, it kind of really goes from start to finish. It starts with a very powerful picture of a driver, because that's where it starts, right? It goes through the journey of trailers and the Loadsmith freight network and hits autonomy, okay? But it starts with the driver, and that's the why, okay? And then if you go to our about page, we have a press release. We've been fortunate; we've gotten some good press. Mm-hmm. You can read about our agreement with Wabash. You can read about Mastery. You can read about our agreement with Kodiak. You can read an agreement about, our Santa Barbara landfill deal, where we sourced a complete zero emission, powertrain for them. We're working on another one with another customer of ours that we're doing a complete zero emission drayage move from LA Long Beach to their new distribution center in Las Vegas. We're heavy into the sustainability side of things. In 2024, you're going to see us announce something regarding that, because the middle mile being autonomous is also perfect for EV or fuel cell. Yeah. And so those are the things, those are our North Stars. And so if you want to learn more about Loadsmith, I'm always I'm a kind of a maniac on email. So my email address is brett@loadsmith.com. And oddly enough, I'm usually responsive within several minutes. So
that's amazing. Well, I will make sure to put all that, except for your email address, in the show notes. Unless you want me to, I can do that. What are you most excited about coming into the holiday peak season-ish thing? What are you most excited? What are you looking forward to?
I just want people to start recognizing that we're all dealing with the same things. It's a stressful business to begin with. Okay. Piling on one another is not going to help anything. And so if we can just start acting like we care about each other, that we're peers, okay? We do things vastly different than a lot of our peer group, okay? I don't look at any of our companies as competitors. I only look at them as comparators.
Interesting. That's a good way to look at it.
And so what am I doing? What are they doing? I'm going to root for them every single time. Now, the last thing I would say is that the one thing that I always remind anybody who works at Loadsmith or I get a chance to talk to is that when you talk about who has skin in the game in this industry, okay, who is invested in this industry, okay, we all invest something in it. Some of us invest capital, some of us invest time. Okay. But we're all investing in the industry together. We're all stakeholders. And the one person that we can't ever forget that probably has most invested in this is the carrier, specifically the owner operator. And so when I work with customers and they have questions about owner operators, you say, let's not forget that individual has more riding on this industry than anybody.
Absolutely.
And so we're all invested. And so what I'm looking forward to most is, look, it's going to be a stressful Q1. I can tell you that. But let's just treat each other with kindness and empathy and encourage each other, even if we have a different way of doing things.
I couldn't have put it better, Brett. I appreciate you for making time today and coming on the program, talking about the company and the stakes of the industry today. I'll have this up in the podcast relatively soon, but thank you for making time, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great to meet you, Matt, and I really appreciate the time.
Oh, we'll have so many more conversations in the future. Well, I got to put you out of the screen, so I'll talk to you here in a moment. Everybody, that's it. That is the podcast. That is, once again, a fleeting conversation, and I'm so happy you had a chance to join us. Look, the reality is this industry is tough. It is not an easy business to be in, and it's important for us to learn from people who are doing this day in and day out. To Brett's point, the people that make the supply chain hum are drivers, mechanics, and forklift operators, material handlers, brokers, shippers who call themselves manufacturers from time to time, and retailers. As always, thank you for taking time to stop in. If you like this podcast, please recommend it to your friends. Give me a 5-star review or any stars. I don't care. Give me something. As always, it's great to have you here. Thank you for spending your Saturday, Friday, Sunday, Monday, whatever day you're listening to this. As always, thank you again for joining us. And then I hit the button that makes it end. So we're doing that. And I hit the end button.